Welcome back. This video is part 4 in a series that I'm calling The Journey. Um, the Journey being another term that we might use for this life between physical birth and physical death. And I mentioned earlier that the purpose of this life is to learn to love God, to learn to love God's creation, to learn to love the other people that God has created, which is everybody, including our enemies, and to learn to love ourselves. And I find learning to love myself to be probably the most difficult of those 4 areas of love that make life purposeful, meaningful. In order to love ourselves, I think we have to get in touch with who we are and where we came from. And so in our last video, I described to you as best I can what my father was like and my relationship with my father. Let me pick it up now with talking about my mother. My mother just recently passed away. She lived to be 97 years old. And most of that time was lucid and able to enjoy the people around her. My mother was the third of 4 children. She was born in 1923. My father was born in 1918. So my mother was born in 1923 in a little town called Chestertown, which is on the eastern shore of Maryland. The eastern shore of Maryland has its own history, which is pretty important, I think. It was a slave-holding area. It was part of the Confederacy. Maryland was split in half during the Civil War. The Mason-Dixon line ran right through Maryland. Baltimore was technically part of the North, but it was a slave port. And there were a lot of slaves who worked in Baltimore. Their masters, I hate that term, but their masters rented them out and usually kept all the money for themselves. And so slaves were sent to work in the factories and on the docks in Baltimore, even though Baltimore technically was part of the Union. So my father's family was from Western Maryland, which was pretty strongly Union, abolitionist. My father's ancestors fought in the Civil War on the Union side. They were abolitionists, but not in the strongly radical Christian sense that many of the abolitionists in New England were. They were abolitionists, I think, more from the standpoint of practicality. But I don't know that for sure. I have a direct ancestor who was in the Union Army for about 10 years, off and on, and who went on to be in Maryland State Legislature, and his ancestor actually fought with General Washington in the Continental Army. But anyway, I'm off on my father's side. Back to my mother, Eastern Shore of Maryland, slave area. This is where Harriet Tubman was from. It's where Frederick Douglass was from. They were both born on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. They both escaped slavery from the Eastern Shore of Maryland. And so the Eastern Shore, still to this day, carries with it this idea of the romanticized Old South. So my mother's mother, my maternal grandmother, was of the strong opinion that there was nothing wrong with slavery at all, that slaves were treated just like family. And you know, even as a boy, I wanted to say, treated just like family. Did sleep in the same house? They have a nice bedroom, eat around the table. No, they lived in shacks, and they did all the work you guys didn't want to do. And you know, uh, anyway, uh, the Eastern Shore of Maryland was not known for big plantations. It was not like Mississippi. It was more tobacco fields. And by the time of the Civil War and just before it, the farmland had been overused, overworked, and really was, as a result, was now very poor soil. And so a lot of the families, the big plantations had shrunk down, and now all that was left was a white master and mistress of kind of low quality, as it were, in that society, owning half a dozen slaves who worked their tobacco fields and whom they rented out in order to limp along. So that was kind of the background. So my mother, born in 1923, the third of 4 children, 2 older sisters and a younger brother. They've all since passed away. My mother was the last of the 4 to go. And they were born into this little town that I just described, a little town that was very, very prejudiced. There was literally a train track that ran through town, and the other side of the tracks were the shacks where all the black people lived. And on the other side of the tracks were the fine houses occupied by the white people. And the black people worked for the white people. They were maids. They did the things that they were domestics. They did the things people didn't want to do. They might make a living. I remember there was an African American man who was blind, and he had a remarkable ability to recane chairs, old-fashioned chairs that had cane seats and backs, and people would take their furniture to him, and he would recane them. So that was the kind of environment that my mother was born into. When she was, I think she was 7, her father committed suicide. And that is the biggest event of my family history. That, and jump forward 3 generations, my son committed suicide. I'll talk a lot more about that in coming videos. My mother was 7 years old. My father, with a pistol, shot himself in the heart. What is really significant about that, suicide's always significant, but the family reacted in complete denial. Suicide, of course, was considered to be highly shameful, but my mother's family went overboard in the denial. So much so that I had no idea how he died until I was grown and married and had kids of my own, and then I discovered it accidentally. I was told, everybody was told, that he had died of pernicious anemia, which was a lie. He may have had pernicious anemia. I have only in my entire life seen one picture of him, and that was just a couple of weeks ago. after my mother died, my sister was going through my mother's things and came across a photograph of our grandfather with 3 other young men, all looking very dapper. And she scanned it and sent it to me. That was the first time I've ever seen a picture of it. The family myth was that everything was always happy and wonderful and beautiful. And once the story slipped out accidentally that he had committed suicide, that was met with, "Oh, but it wasn't a terrible thing." I mean, my uncle portrayed it almost as if my grandfather was a martyr. I think my uncle said something to the effect that, it was the Great Depression and there were too many mouths to feed, so he took one of the mouths out. Like, what a guy, what a martyr, doing this great thing. And man, I remember thinking, what a guy. I never met him and I'm mad at him. I could have had a grandpa. I never had a grandfather. I could have had one. He left my grandmother with 4 small children to raise by herself in a culture and a society when the only job that a woman could get, unless she was trained to be a nurse, would be to be a teacher. So she was a teacher. She had to take my uncle, her youngest, with her to play on the back bench all day while she taught school. She taught 4th grade there in a little, 3 or 4 room schoolhouse in Chestertown, Maryland. So my mother was never told what had happened to her father. The way she found out was she and her little brother, remember my mother was 7, I think, and so her little brother would have been 5, and they were out in the yard playing, and the town garbage men came by to collect the trash. And one of them said to the other, "Those are the Russell children whose father committed suicide." That's the only way my mother ever knew. No one was ever going to tell her. And having learned that way, she lived in a home where you didn't dare say that to anybody. I think her oldest sister, found their dad. I'm not certain about that. So they completely denied. They covered that up. That's huge. Family secrets are toxic. Get it out in the open. Talk about it. Family secrets are the worst thing you can do to a family system, and they will reverberate for generations. They will have adverse effects for generations. You're never, ever doing your loved ones a favor by keeping those kinds of family secrets. A few years later, I don't know how old my mother was at the time. I should have asked her, but I never did. Her mother became ill, and I can sure understand why, all the stress that she was under. She contracted tuberculosis, and back in those days, they had no cure for tuberculosis. So anyone with TB was sent off to a sanitarium where they were fed a diet rich in dairy products and where they were exposed to lots of fresh air and sunshine. And a few of them got better. Most of them did not. My grandmother got better, but she was gone for a year. Now remember, my mother was born in 1923. Her dad died when she was 7. So 1930, we're right in the middle there of the Great Depression. So both my parents grew up in the Great Depression. And that strongly influenced them. So here we are, father commits suicide, no dad. Mom gets sick. They send her away to a sanitarium. She was gone for a year. When you're a little kid, a year is like a lifetime. So she's gone for a year. Again, the family completely denied till their deaths that there was anything negative about that. They never grieved the death of their father. They never grieved the sickness and absence of their mother. In talking about it, my mother and her siblings would tell you that it was a glorious time. Oh, yes, the children were split up, and, this one went to live with that relative, and this one lived on the other side of town with this other relative, and this one was over here, and I was over there. But, it was a small town, and we saw each other once in a while, and we were all well cared for, and, oh, gosh, we just have this beautiful, wonderful, close, connected family that takes care of each other, and everything was just roses and peachy, and those darkies that live on the other side of the tracks, we like them, and we treat them just like family too. They're the ones that come over and clean our houses and make our beaten biscuits. And that was the it drives me crazy. That was the environment my mother grew up in and perpetuated till the day she died. She was convinced that slavery was a good thing, that Uncle Tom's Cabin was a horrible book, that her whole childhood was glorious and happy, and so forth. So that's my mother. She went, like all of her siblings did, to Washington College in the same town in which she grew up, Chestertown. It was a little college town, and she was able to live at home. Oh, I should mention, too, when her mother finally got back from the sanitarium, because they'd fed her all these dairy products, she had gained some weight. My grandmother was never obese, but she was filled out some when she came back from that year of eating cream and sitting in the sun. And my mother was deeply shocked. She was horrified. And I know her oldest sister was also. I don't know about the other two. And from then on, my mother had this thing against fat. She absolutely despised fatness. She looked down on anybody who was even slightly obese. She weighed herself, 90-something pounds. She was only 4'11". She was a little ball of energy, by the way. But anyway, she weighed herself every single day. My therapist asked me the other day if she had an eating disorder. I'd never thought of it that way, but probably yes. She was so conscious of weight and so worried about gaining weight. She would take a bouillon cube with her to work for lunch. So she was a freshman. My father was a senior. She met and married him after he was in the Navy. Remember, if you listen to the last video, he was in graduate school, and then he went into the Navy and was commissioned as an officer. And she married him during that time. So for most of their first 4 years of marriage, he was gone. He was at sea. After college, she lived in, I'm not sure where she lived. I know she lived in Chestertown for a while. I think she lived in Baltimore for a while. I think she lived in New Jersey for a while and worked in one of the resorts there. This would have been during World War II. So that's her family. let me tell you a little bit about her personality. I mentioned she was just a ball of energy. She was always on the go. um, Up early, get everybody up while they're getting ready, making all the beds in the house, making breakfast for everybody in the family, making lunches for everybody in the family, getting my sister and I off to school, seeing my father off to work, dashing out the door, hopping in the car, driving herself to one of the worst areas at the time, one of the worst areas of Baltimore, where she worked as a lab technician in the Johns Hopkins School of Hygiene. She worked in the Department of Anatomy and also later in the Department of Pharmacology. She was the first electron microscope technician in the United States of America. One of the professors, all of her bosses, quote unquote bosses, were MDs as well as PhDs, all of them involved in medical research. And she was a lab technician. One of her bosses, the electron microscope had just been invented, and in Germany, he went to Germany, he learned how to run the thing. Johns Hopkins ordered one, and it was shipped to them, and he taught her how to operate it, and from then on, she was the electron microscope technician, which was cutting-edge technology, so she had to take pictures and develop pictures and work in research. She always put on a facade of being upbeat and happy. She blamed my father for everything that was ever wrong in her life. She seemed, from the time long as back as I can remember, she seemed to despise my father. She tried to triangulate me against him on a regular basis. She criticized him to me. She blamed him for any of her feelings. I think she was always under the surface depressed, but always living in denial of that. She was highly intelligent, kept herself very busy, made friends pretty easily, and she was responsible, she made herself responsible for everything social that the family did. So on those occasions when my paternal grandmother, who lived with us, was invited up to have dinner with us, that was at my mother's initiation and insistence. My father was disconnected from his sister and her family, but my mother would invite them over. My mother made sure that we took regular trips to Chestertown to visit her mother. Her mother came to Baltimore to visit us. Our family and my Uncle John's family got together regularly, holidays and other times, lived close together for a while, and then they moved a little further out, but still all of that was my mother's doing. So she would go to work. Excuse me. My paternal grandmother would be there to care for me as a little toddler. She would come back from work. She would make dinner, serve dinner, clean up after dinner, wash all the dishes, and then join my father in the living room where they would both be reading big volumes and listening to classical music. So that gives you a snapshot of my mother, Naomi Taylor.